1787, the HMS Bounty left England on a 2-year voyage to Tahiti to collect breadfruit trees. The ship was under the command of the notorious Captain William Bligh, known for his strict and sometimes cruel disciplinary methods. As the ship was leaving Tahiti to return to England with the breadfruit trees, a mutiny took place. Lieutenant Fletcher Christian and his mutineers left Captain Bligh and his loyalists in a lifeboat and sailed the ship back to Tahiti. Over the course of the next couple of centuries, there were a number of adaptations of this historical event, but the 1935 movie starring Charles Laughton and Clark Gable is largely considered to be the best. So much so that in 1997, when the American Film Institute was putting together their list of the top 100 greatest American films of all time, they included this film at number 86. And though the film didn't make the revised list in 2007, we're still going to take a look at Mutiny on the Bounty and find out what's all the fuss about.
Do you follow me?
Not really.
Fight in here. This is a
Shoot your eye out, kid.
You always do the right thing. Why is the run go so serious?
Mr. Christian, you will sign this book.
Mr. Bligh, ship's company will bear witness that I sign in obedience to your orders. But remember, sir, I shall demand a court of inquiry in England.
You mutinous dog.
Retract that, sir.
I will repeat it. You're a mutinous dog.
Mr. Christian.
So I haven't done this series for a while, so for those of you who are a little bit confused, here's the deal. Back when I was first starting to look seriously at reviewing movies, I decided I wanted to learn a little bit more about cinema, and I decided the best way to do that was to look at some of the films that are considered the greatest of all time. And so I started with the American Film Institute's list of the top 100 films of all time, which they actually made 2 of, one in 1998 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of cinema, and another one in 2007 to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the 100th year anniversary of cinema. And I have been working my way down both lists, kind of going back and forth to catch films that were cut from the 1998 list when they revised it in 2007. Mutiny on the Bounty is one of these Lost 23, and because it is technically based on an historical event, anytime it's talked about, discussions of historical accuracy and whether or not the things that they portray in the film actually happen inevitably come up. But this film is less based on the historical event and more closely based on the novelization of this event by 2 authors whose names I can't remember. Charles Nordoff and James Norman Hall. It is intended to be a dramatic work of fiction rather than a documentary of the Mutiny on the Bounty, and so we're going to set aside the historical discussion, at least for now, and talk about the story itself. Ultimately, this film is a showdown between 2 characters, Captain William Bligh, played by Charles Laughton, and Lieutenant Fletcher Christian, played by Clark Gable. Christian is the story's main protagonist. He's essentially the second command of the Bounty, and he is shown in the early scenes to be a loyal officer and a strict disciplinarian, but also a man of compassion who knows how to relate to his men and get the best out of them. Captain Bligh, in contrast, is notorious for being a cruel disciplinarian and using very harsh methods to keep his men in line. In one of the early scenes, there is a man who is being punished for some crime that he committed, and he is being sailed around from ship to ship and being whipped 5 times at each one. So he's basically being punished by the entire fleet, but by the time he gets to Captain Bligh's ship, he's already died from all the whipping. Undeterred, however, Captain Bligh decides that the dead man should be whipped anyway. Over time, as the journey progresses, we see Captain Bligh prove himself to be tyrannical, thin-skinned, and deeply paranoid. And we watch Christian, this very loyal officer in the British Navy, become more and more uncomfortable being his lieutenant. In the early scenes, he seems very much like the perfect officer, and it's interesting to watch his progression from that to a mutineer. Interesting enough, I would argue that the romance between him and the native of Tahiti that we see wasn't really necessary, although that aspect maybe was possibly based on historical events. The crew on the Bounty did have an extended stay in Tahiti once they had gotten the breadfruit trees, and it is indicated that many of them formed romantic attachments while they were there. And there's no doubt that discipline decreased after they left Tahiti, leaving Captain Bligh to resort to crueler and crueler methods to keep his men in line. And that's probably what ultimately led to the mutiny, but the movie goes to great lengths to portray Christian as a reasonable man man, and a man who, if he was going to lead a mutiny against his captain, he'd have a pretty good reason for it. And the romance in Tahiti kind of muddles that for me. It would have been enough, I think, if his reasons for leading the mutiny were entirely moral ones. He disagrees with Captain Bligh's ways of running a ship, and not just because he's got some booty waiting for him back on Tahiti. Another major player in the drama, Midshipman Byam, becomes a friend to Christian over the course of the movie and sort of acts as the voice of reason during all of this. He's actually at odds with Christian when the mutiny takes place, and they even say that they really can't even be friends anymore because of it, and it leads us to question whether or not the mutiny was necessary or even the right thing to do. And while the progression of Christian's character is interesting, there are parts of it that just don't really quite jive for me. Maybe it's just because the handsome and charming Clark Gable doesn't feel like he belongs in the British Navy, but there are parts of the characterization that just seem a little off. Not so much so that I didn't still enjoy the movie, but just a little out of place here and there. Bligh, in contrast, is utterly fascinating. In the first half of the movie, he's basically the bad guy, using the cruelest of methods to sort out the smallest of infractions, even if they're only imagined by him, and endangering the safety and health of his crew for his own career and comfort. But after the mutiny took place and Bligh and his loyalists were abandoned basically in open sea and left to die, Bligh did actually make his way back to England, a journey of some 4,000 miles. And he did so using a lot of those same methods, proving himself to be an able leader whose methods, though they seem cruel, can work in the right circumstances. The scene with Bligh in the lifeboat shows another side of this captain, and we're left not entirely sure how we feel about this man or his methods. The scope of this film is also very impressive, especially for a film that was made in 1935. It's very much the definition of cinematic. You really get a feel for the length of this voyage, the feeling of not having enough water, the cruelty of the punishments, and the relief of finally arriving at their destination after 2 years just through what they show us on the screen. If nothing else, I appreciate this movie for the cinematic experience that it provides. It does a lot with very, very little. And it's important to remember that this story is very much a fiction, even though it is based on real-life events. Although Christian is portrayed as the righteous good guy and Bligh as the cruel bad guy, more recent historical interpretations of the event have actually gone in the other direction, casting Bligh in a more sympathetic light and showing Christian to be more unreasonable and aggressive. And even though I said a moment ago that I wasn't crazy about the romance in Tahiti and how that kind of muddied the characterization of Fletcher Christian, that is probably closer to what actually happened. Also, the ending isn't nearly as happy and idyllic as it appears. When they did finally find the last surviving mutineer on Tahiti, they discovered that the other mutineers, including Christian, had killed each other in various disputes. But for a lot of that, we can just forgive it for having been made in the 1930s. A more modern interpretation of this event might muddy the waters a little bit more and portray the characters more as we saw them in the second half of the movie. Ultimately, though, in spite of its flaws, I did enjoy this movie quite a lot. For the time that it was released, it's quite impressive as an experience, and it's definitely deserving of its spot on the top 100 list. The scope is impressive, the characters are interesting, and the story, though maybe not as accurate or true to life as it might be, is still very engaging. The fuss is definitely merited, though I can see why maybe it didn't make it onto the revision of the list in favor of other movies, but even so, on the worth meter, I would give this one a worth owning. Next time, we're going to look at something completely different. Number 85 on the list is a Marx Brothers movie called A Night at the Opera. That should be fun. See you then.
I'll live to see you, all of you, hanging from the highest yard arm in the British fleet.